Hello and welcome. This is ICTC's panel on the future of work, preparing for a dynamic world of work. My name is Kieran O'Neill. I work as a research and policy analyst at ICTC. We recently completed a second report on the future of work. It's called Emergent Employment, Canadian Findings on the Future of Work, and we'll share it in the chat. And in it, we focused largely on remote work and gig work and the pandemic. But as you'll hear today, this is a really broad topic area, and we wanted to build on this conversation further. So we've invited 4 wonderful panelists to join us and do that today. In our research, we heard from workers, employers, and various experts that the world of work is at a really interesting point. Lots of things are changing rapidly, from working relationships and norms to the labor force and skills needs and the impacts of tech. And these are important changes to pay attention to. Work is what lots of people spend the majority of their days or lives doing, and it's how people survive, often how people define themselves. Whether this should be the case is maybe up for question, but basically a lot of us are pretty obsessed with work, and so it's important that we think about its future very closely. So we're lucky to have 4 wonderful speakers join us and help us think about the future of work today. Our format is going to be kind of rapid fire. So each of our speakers is going to give you just a short pitch on why a particular topic is the most critical thing to think about when it comes to the future of work. We'll be able to follow up with a few quick questions. And if you have questions or comments for the panelist, please feel free to share them in the chat. So each of our panelists deserves a long introduction given their impressive backgrounds, but I'm going to quit talking and let you hear directly from them. So in about 30 seconds each, I said this would be rapid fire, could you each introduce yourselves and explain why you are interested in the future of work? And I'll start with you, Tricia.
Thanks so much, Kieran. It's wonderful to be here with you and this great panel and the audience. So I'm Tricia Williams. I'm the Director of Research, Evaluation, and Knowledge Mobilization at the Future Skills Center. For those of you who don't know, the Future Skills Center is a federally funded but independent research center working on testing and innovating and learning about what works for skills development and skills changes in Canada. So I've been working on the future of work for several years. Prior to this, I was with the MasterCard Foundation, working on similar issues in Africa, across various African countries. And so I've just been intrigued by the future of work and how it's very different in different contexts. So we tend to think of it as a monolithic thing, but when you really take a global perspective, it means very different things for different places and people. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Sorry, muted. Thanks, Tricia. Maybe Terrell, you can go next.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Kieran and everyone at the ICTC for the opportunity. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Terrell Forsyth. I'm a co-founder and head of product at FutureFit AI, where I lead product strategy, development, and user experience at the company. What we do is work with different organizations in the workforce ecosystem, such as large enterprises, governments, workforce boards and associations, and employment agencies to help workers make faster, smarter, and more successful career transitions in the future of work. Before my work at FutureFit AI, I worked at the intersection of policy and data at Employment and Social Development Canada, where I was involved in all kinds of things from applied machine learning to data analytics and research design for Canada's pension plan disability program. And there I was really exposed to some of the challenges that people face in returning to work after being out of the labor market for some time. And that still kind of feeds into my work today at FutureFit and why I believe that reimagining career guidance is the most important topic for the future of work, which I will be going into detail a little bit later.
Thank you, Tricia. Over to you, Kai.
Yeah, I'm Kai, and I am currently doing my PhD at HEC Montreal and in organizational behavior and human resources, where I focus on the digital economy and industrial relations. And thank you very much to the organizers and the co-panelists and to you, the audience, as well. And I think the main reason why I am here is mainly because what I'm going to be presenting and sharing was first presented 3 years ago in 2018 to policymakers. And then now today's presentation is a way of an update on what are some of the things that I believe would be important for us to focus as well. And part of this motivation came from a lot of my work and research on the future of work internationally since 2016. And this was also influenced by some of the work at the International Labour Organization as well.
Thank you, Kai. Last but not least, Michael.
I'll be quick. I'm Michael Urban. I'm the acting director for research and special projects, with the special project being the Future Skills Center at the Ted Rogers School of Management's Diversity Institute here in Toronto. And the Diversity Institute is a research lead for the Future Skills Center that Trisha is representing. And so we work closely together. And we at Diversity Institute are focused on what the future of work is, what the future of skills are, how we can build a future of work that is more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive, and also how all of these other pieces fit together. So just want to say thank you to everyone, all the co-panelists here. I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you to ICTC for inviting us, and thank you to the audience for coming to this event. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Michael. As I said, 4 truly fantastic panelists. So now we'll turn it over to Trisha to talk about diversity in the future of work.
Thanks so much, Kieran. This is really exciting. Usually when I join these panels, I give the long spiel about the Future Skills Center and what we're up to. So this time I get to actually say some of the things I've been thinking about and noodling about, based, of course, in a lot of the work and research that we're doing. So please, check out our website if you want to find anything else. But for my little pitch, I was asked to think about, what do I think is one of the most critical issues facing or shaping the future of work, or defining the future of work. So like most things, I picked some sort of analogy that can fit lots of pieces in it. So I want to say, the future of work is a box of crayons. And we've heard this kind of analogy before to mean a lot of different colors, a lot of diversity. And I want to drill down on that and think about what kind of diversity we mean. And I want to talk about 3 things. So the first thing is, we're talking about digital crayons, not just old school analog crayons anymore. So you can see we have a picture of a digital crayon there. So obviously I'm talking to this group at ICTC. We know that technology is really key to the future of work and how work is changing. But I want to suggest that there's a diversity of drivers shaping work. And the future of work is about not just looking monolithically at only technology, but also considering a variety of things, and how they're going to play out over the next 20, 30 years will really determine what this next period of work looks like. So I'm thinking of things like climate change and how it reshapes both opportunities in a green economy, as well as, climate refugees and people who have to move and reshape their livelihoods because of changes in climate. Also global trade patterns. We saw, 50 years of liberalization and opening free trade. And more recently, in the last decade, we've seen a retrenchment and a closure of borders, and more nationalism, protectionism of markets and borders. So how this plays out will drastically affect the kinds of work people do and how those patterns play out. Demographics are very different in different contexts. We're, experiencing labor shortages in Canada, and thinking about an aging population, and more of the boomers retiring and getting old and needing elder care. It's really the opposite in places like Africa that have huge young populations and burgeoning young people and fewer older people to open up those pathways and opportunities to them. So demographics really shape what the future of work looks like in different places. So all of this to suggest is we can't think of work and the future of work in terms of only technology. It's important, but it's not the only thing. The other thing I want to suggest is that workforce diversity is increasing. And I think we certainly experience that in Canada, but it's not the only place where that is the case. So we are encountering increasingly diversity of cultures and backgrounds, and that really adds so much in terms of assets to our workplaces and to the kinds of companies and organizations we are building. But in this context, it's human engagement and working with people across different groups is more important than ever. So we'll need to drill down on those skills around working with people, collaboration, engagement, communication. All of those very human dimensions of the future of work will be more critical than ever. And the last thing I want to briefly mention, because I have no idea how much time I've used, is that we need to think about the box of crayons in terms of representing a diversity of tasks and skills. So we know it's very well established that, jobs are shifting in terms of the kinds of tasks that are in them. So we know that it's been easier to automate and mechanize very routine tasks. And certainly as AI increasingly is creeping into all sorts of different industries and places, not just technology. But we see that the tasks and skills that are necessary in different jobs is shifting. So we're going to see jobs composed of different tasks, different groups of tasks, and the skill areas required to do a job are increasingly diverse. So you need not only foundational skills and technical skills, but you also need interpersonal skills, as I was mentioning. And management skills. So these are all different groups of skills that people will need to be continually investing in order to successfully navigate this future of work. So this is the box of crayons. It's going to mean moving between a lot of different things over the course of someone's career. And it'll mean a lot of different things for different countries. So we need to think of it both in terms of what positions Canada competitively in a global sense, but also thinking about it in terms of our own companies and organizations. So thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. I feel like you really widened the scope of things here for us. So it's a great opening. Next up, we have Teralyn. Over to you.
Great. Yeah, happy to jump right into it. So I'm here today to convince you all that reimagining career guidance is actually the most important factor in the future of work. And that's for 3 reasons that I'll outline in detail. It's the most underinvested part of the workforce ecosystem today relative to others. It's the most underdeveloped area for a digital age. And number 3, it has the potential to be actually the most valuable contributor to actually making work more meaningful for workers. And so before we can jump into most of that, we can't address the most important factor if we don't actually understand the problem. So I'm going to make a time-saving assumption here today that most of you have actually seen a slide just like this, that places an emphasis on a particular shock event, automation, digital disruption, or even now COVID-19. And then the natural follow-on is to say, this event happened. Now, we have a skills gap to handle. Therefore, we need reskilling and online courses, training, etc. While there's definitely value in some of that perspective, I think sometimes our fixation on the reskilling, upskilling component of this is somewhat of a misguided understanding. So yes, these things are impacting the way that we work, but the effects are actually highly variable when you start to dig into the real human experience of what workers go through. I think what we can at the end of the day confidently say is that we all agree on that the future of work will be defined by career transitions. And I'm going to go into arguing that these transitions are going to need to be supported by much more than just skills training. Basically due to the fact that digital technology has essentially acted as a major shock. And what it's really done is it's made work more atomic. So I think we had crayons in the last presentation. We have this atomic design concept in this one, lots of analogies to keep track of already. But what this basically means is that it's been unbundled from its intermediary components and broken down into fundamental building blocks. So just like Tricia used the analogy of crayons representing tasks and skills. There's this concept of atomic design, which basically says there's a building block that builds up to a larger component in and of itself. So I'm pulling on this analogy as a product person that works in technology, and we use this concept all the time. So again, the idea is breaking down an entire interface, something that we're using actually today, into those building blocks and then working up from there. So It's a really interesting concept, and I apply it to how I think about the future of work all the time in terms of solving for increased complexity. So as policymakers, I think what's a really good application of this is instead of having to try to predict what the future of work is going to be, 10 years down the road in terms of careers and employment and demand, we can actually take a look at the building blocks first and see how they might unbundle and rebundle over time. And then as workers, instead of trying to make a 10-year career plan, we can look at the building blocks, like skills, activities, values, interests, and identify what just the next step might be in a career depending on the direction that I want to be moving in. So what this means is, yes, this has actually led to a complete increase in the variability of the kinds of work and careers one might be able to pursue, and the pathways to actually getting there aren't actually very clear. So this has resulted in a huge, I think, upswing. It's been part of the driving factor of things like remote work, gig work, hybrid, flex, co-work. There's all these variations because that variation definition is actually endless. It's been unbounded. So again, what this means for the career guidance problem is that transition events moving from one work experience to another can look quite different depending on the individual and very different than it did even a few years ago. So if work is being increasingly atomic, it means that the real experience of career transitions aren't just about skills. It's an involved and iterative exercise that actually involves becoming much more aware and navigating all the different building blocks that you might have access to. So the real challenge then becomes enabling live iterative navigation that learns with the labor market and the individual over time. So those are three really important aspects that I think where we can reimagine career guidance. That it essentially requires an entire pipeline of information, supports, and resources to actually facilitate those transitions successfully. So if you think about a GPS or using Google Maps, I use Google Maps to get to where I'm located today. I didn't buy my phone with all the predefined destinations I would ever have to go to baked into that phone. What the phone was built for was adapting, in the moment, on the fly, based on my location, based where I wanted to go, and then navigating me through that experience. So similarly, depending on what's happening in a worker's life, they might need job search strategies. They might be considering a hybrid work approach. They might be considering holding 2 jobs at one time. They might be considering starting a venture or a side hustle on the side and need supports to facilitate that kind of transition. So now this is a really radical departure of how career guidance, I think, is still thought about and practiced today. And in the career guidance space, if you look into the history of it, how we think and educate others on their career choice really hasn't changed much since even the late 19th century. It's largely been a bit of an art versus a methodical science. And this is where I actually see a lot of opportunity in exploring why a more effective science of career guidance, what that could look like. We can actually take the same atomic design principles of how work has been broken down into its component parts and pair it with that data, with data and technology that we have today, and apply it to how we deliver career guidance to workers. So things like breaking down components of what work looks like, what a worker's profile looks like, and the needs that they have, we can actually create technology that allows a more iterative approach to career design, is designed to learn with them along the way, and then captures outcomes that actually matter at a very granular level. So in summary, if career transitions are going to be a distinctive part of the future of work, and if they are going to be more frequent, pervasive, and intense over time, new approaches to career guidance are actually going to be very pivotal in making sure that the increased optionality of work that is actually available actually works for workers. So to summarize and recap really quickly, work is now atomic, complex, and variable. Career navigation is much harder than ever. And I would argue that reimagined career guidance is, in fact, the most important factor to the future of work because it can make work more meaningful.
Thank you, Terlin. I have lots that I want to ask you, especially this kind of idea of unbundling. And I think you've foreshadowed a bit of future discussion on that as well. But for now, I'll turn it over to Kai.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so what I'm going to be arguing is for the future work, the focus should be on the future workers. So what I'm going to be sharing with you was first presented 3 years ago in 2018 to policymakers, and I want to update some of the assumptions and findings then with the actual realities that we have now. So, so why is a doctoral researcher, ex-policy maker here talking to you about the future of work? Well, the reason why I decided to do research after working internationally on the future of work at the International Labour Organization since 2016 was influenced by the South African businessman who represented global employers and who rightly reminded us there's a lot of theory, we need empirical evidence in order to shape and navigate the future of work and its emerging risks. So going forward, he added, we need the imagination, creativity, and innovation to know which problems are not just mere imagination, but real. So I would like to help us to look at a few risks and possible ways forward. So the promise of digital technology has fallen short of its full potential. The benefits of technology are often offset by emerging risks and of greater control, inequality, and concentration. So let's complexify this discussion even more. And now we're focusing on digital power is already concentrated in the hands of few. And I have evidence of this now. And so digital dividends are the returns on the investment in digital technology in the forms of growth, jobs, and services that empower and support businesses, people, and governments. And research have found that technology and the internet will only reinforce or amplify the power relations in society and not disrupt the existing accountability relationships, leading to greater control by a few, if we wish to let it. So wages has not grown in real terms in Canada for over 4 decades, while productivities have increased. So wages has a factor of demand and supply of competencies and employment relations between groups have shifted indeed, but also automation that allows labor reducing technologies to be put into the workplace have changed this ever more. So the concentration of digital market power by a few oligopolies have widened this inequality and dampens the competition and thereby perpetuating economic and political advantages and positions. So what are these emerging risks? So part of this is the changing pattern that we're seeing in the reorganization of production and work in Canada. So as mentioned before, new technology is enabling the emergence of new forms of work like digital labor, gig work, and the adminization of work itself, as mentioned. And so this has promoted the casualization of the worker. And so this has actually made workers more disposable and shifted the fundamental rights of workers and the responsibilities for the employees away from the employer via technological circumvention, I argue. And more on the gig work and remote work will be discussed more by Kieran later on, so I'm not going to touch on that too much. But what I want to highlight here is also there's going to be fewer winners and much more losers. So new technologies is enabling the rise of this winner-take-all economy with increasing inequality and income disparity, where middle-class jobs will be disappearing due to job polarization. So a part of this winner-take-all economy is the concentration of digital power in the hands of a few, as mentioned, which distorts markets and dampens competition while widening inequalities. So let's focus on the leading platforms and the tech giants. So right now, 7 out of the 10 largest companies globally by market capitalization are platform businesses. And according to the platform index, which comprised of the 15th largest platforms by weighted share value, have actually increased during the pandemic by 48%, and so far in this year, 2021, by 32%. But if we look at the question of control, inequality, and concentration, well, remember these are the emerging risks, and then these are very true risks that we are facing now as policymakers and researchers and as workers that we should all be concerned about, is looking at, okay, where are the 100 most valuable platforms and companies are. So far, these 100 firms have gained 1.6 trillion since the beginning of this year, and altogether they are valued at $15.5 trillion. And so this hyper concentration in digital power is actually quite unique as well. It is concentrated in two geographic locations, with companies that are headquartered in the US and China, with 77% in the US and the rest in China, with Europe making up 4%, Africa 1%, and rest of the world, including Canada, in that 5% that's left over. So before, my response to this was, yes, we can we can complement workers by augmenting them with new competencies that can work with new technologies and also use better labor market information. However, now I would like to say, okay, actually the issues of concentration is immense inequality. And then this is something that we will have to pay attention to, where labor share in the national income in terms of wages have declined over time, right, over the last 4 decades. And this is partially because of policies and also values where we have weakened the role of labor. While we work, there's a redistribution mechanism in terms of income for that productivity gain that can also be that can come from technological innovation. Jennifer Welch at McGill have said this leveling of inequality during the decades after the Second World War was an outlier. So a blip in history created by Great War, droughts, and economic recession. And she says that in the future, we will see low growth and a form of capitalism that's joined with high level of inequality and low level of social mobility. And I think for many Canadians, housing and things such as inflation on food, they are quite big on this year's agenda. However, what happened during that blip in history when inequality in Canada was actually on the downturn? Well, this was a time of great economic democracy, where trade union density and the institution of works were at its height, and where there was collective representation and bargaining. So new worker voices and collective actions are needed now more than ever to counterbalance the rise of digital power. And also, we have examples here of the Alphabet Worker Union of computer engineers in US and Canada earlier this year, right? But we also have workers in Dollarama, gig workers, migrant workers, and also UNI has workers as well. And to summarize, so to realize the potential of technological innovation and to address the emerging risks of concentration, inequality, and control, we definitely have to invest in the analog components or the foundations of regulations, workers, and foundations for a more equitable future of workers. And here, I think it is quite important to note that we do need regulation to counter and to foster competition against this concentration of digital power, but also promote lifelong learning and the hybridization of competencies to ensure there's ways to address this inequality, and also institutions to make actors more accountable and responsible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. You've made the case pretty clearly that workers, I think, are central to the future of work. Next up, we have Michael. Hi, sorry, Michael, just to interrupt you, you're muted. I know the feeling. I've done that myself many times. Thanks. There we go. Okay.
Well, I'm sorry you missed my incredible opening, but hello. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be presented with such a great opportunity to share some thoughts on the future of work and to hear from these wonderful co-panelists. Thanks to ICTC for the opportunity and for all of you in the audience for taking the time out of your busy schedules to participate in today's events. So I don't have much time, so I've tried to keep things pretty simple. Here's a plan of the presentation. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward. So why don't we dive right in? So I've been studying the future of work in a variety of forms for close to 6 years now, and something has really started to pop out for me. In almost every think piece or report focused on the future of work, that is capital F, capital W, that I read, lifelong learning, or something very much like it, is identified as a critical piece of how we all adapt, or how we all need to adapt in order to succeed and thrive in the future of work. We're told that it's simply not sustainable for everyone to spend 2 to 10 years in post-secondary education at the start of their careers and then get a job and be done with education. So far, so good. But the problem that jumps out to me in this analysis is that it rarely goes much further before it moves on to focus on something else entirely. Sure, maybe we're told that Canadian firms are laggards and that don't invest enough in the training for their workers. Or maybe we're told that one of the problems with our current employment insurance system is that it integrates very awkwardly with retraining programs and further education, which makes it very difficult for the people who actually are the ones who most need reskilling or upskilling to engage in it. And of course, we're also told that work integrated learning is the gold standard for learning job-related skills, and that we should all be figuring out ways to do more of it. But these exhortations really only nibble around the edges and don't get connected in any sort of systematic or comprehensive way. Or stated more directly, I have yet to see a substantive description of what a serious implementation of a system of lifelong learning actually looks like. Nor has anyone been able to point me towards a fleshed out example of a system at any level, firm, regional, national, etc., that could serve as a model for us here in Canada. This seems very odd to me, given the unanimous agreement on how important getting lifelong learning right is. So what I want to pitch to you today is the idea that filling this gap is the most important thing we can do to bring us closer to realizing a future of work that works for everyone. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Maybe you're skeptical, and I still need to convince you that lifelong learning is sufficiently important to merit consideration in this highly competitive pitch competition. The way I see it, the imperative for getting lifelong learning right can be broken down into two parts, specific and general motivators. The lists I have provided here are not meant to be comprehensive. They just represent what I see as the most obvious examples of these two categories of motivators. For instance, COVID-19 has demonstrated clearly that unexpected things can occur, well, unexpectedly. Who would have guessed 2 years ago that we would be, excuse me, my Slack is invading my presentation. Who would have guessed 2 years ago that we would need to go through what we've experienced in the past 18 months? Adaptation has been key to responding and surviving the pandemic, and the ability to learn new skills at various points has been a key part of this adaptation for many people and for society as a whole. The ability to learn continuously across our careers will also be critical to both mitigating and adapting to any other massive change we are facing. Specific climate change, for example. Millions of workers around the world are going to need to transition into new careers and revamp their skill sets if we're going to have any hope of avoiding the worst of climate change and simultaneously ensuing something that approximates a just transition for these workers. At a more general level, there are a number of ongoing trends which suggest that whatever is happening in the outside world, the very nature of work is changing in ways which make it likely that workers are going to need to be able to update and upgrade their skills with much more frequency. The increased pace of technological change means that many of the skills learned at the start of one's career will become obsolete much more quickly. To stay relevant and competitive in the labor market, learning new skills will be essential. New technologies, such as internet-enabled digital platforms, are also enabling the unbundling of work, as shown in Figure 1, which is essentially the same idea as Terlin's atomization. And while the focus in discussions of the impacts of unbundling is often on automation, which is forcing a lot of displaced workers to learn new skills, another key aspect of this process is more abstract, namely how it brings much greater resolution and more granular perspective to the components of work. Indeed, as it becomes possible to engage with work in a more granular way, this enables or even demands a similar, more granular perspective on training, something that aligns well with an approach to training that sees it distributed throughout our careers instead of in just big inflexible chunks at the beginning. And even if globalization is slowing down for political reasons, it isn't going away. Instead, new forms of globalization enabled by the internet mean that white-collar workers are starting to feel the pressures that have been forcing blue-collar workers to look for new ways to upskill for years. So, I hope you accept the premise that lifelong learning is important. Next, I hope you'll see that when you start to think hard about how we might answer the question of how we get it right, it becomes clear that this question actually ties together a number of very hot topics in this broader future of work discussion. For instance, how does one teach in a world of lifelong learning? What sorts of pedagogies are most effective? I feel like we are getting pulled in multiple directions on this one. On the one hand, we're told that work-integrated learning is key, but work-integrated learning is a high-touch, fairly high-resource approach to learning, and to do it right, needs a lot of buy-in and planning on the part of employers. Alternatively, we're also told that asynchronous learner-directed learning, like massive open online courses, MOOCs, where learners can learn at their own pace and can challenge assessment tools as often as they like until they've mastered a concept, is critical. And what about the potential of new technologies like augmented and virtual reality? I expect all of these important components are important components of the answer, and that context will be determinative. But this only makes the answer to our question more complex and difficult to articulate. Another key question that enmeshes a number of these issues: if learning is happening at greater granularity and in more bite-sized chunks, how do we identify, assess, and credential this learning? And how do we connect learners' portfolios of skills with employers' needs? One of the things we have found in our research is that employers don't really know what their skills needs are, let alone at a more granular level. How do we build a more precise practice of human resources that takes identifying and assessing employers' needs with precision as serious as it does in evaluating candidates' capabilities? How do we establish a common language around what skills are out there and what possessing a specific skill entails? And of course, the question lurking behind all of this is, who pays for it? So I'm running out of time, but I hope what I've said so far provides a strong indication of both the importance and the challenges associated with getting lifelong learning right. As I've dug into this topic, my provisional answer for why it has been so poorly researched to date is because of how it brings together so many difficult questions, often in very specific and practical ways. So while there are good reasons for why these questions haven't been answered yet, it also highlights the importance of at least beginning to do so, something that we're taking steps towards at Diversity Institute as part of our ongoing research into future of work and future of skills. And so I wanted to close my pitch today by highlighting a few key guiding principles that I think are critical to keep in mind as we work to get lifelong learning right. First, a focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion is key. To be a true solution, whatever form lifelong learning takes needs to avoid recreating existing structures of privilege and exclusion, both for the good of individual human beings, but also because we'll need contributions from everyone if we're going to overcome the challenges that we face. Second, too much skills discourse is focused on fixing the worker. As I hope I've made clear with even this brief presentation, we need improved systems and infrastructure that better meet worker needs. And a big part of doing that is actually helping employers figure out what they need to do, or what skills they need, in a more genuine and precise way. And finally, while technology is creating a lot of the challenges that we've talked about today, it also offers a lot of potential solutions. Making full and smart use of technology will be critical to getting this answer right. So, thanks for listening. I look forward to your questions and the great discussions with other panelists I expect is coming.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think I like to think that even events like this kind of qualify as a type of lifelong learning. Hopefully, that's the case for some of you in the audience. I have a few questions that I would like to ask of all of our panelists, or most of our panelists if we have time. And first one, not to make it all about ICTC, but in our recent report on the future of work, we paid a lot of attention to gig work. Two of you also brought up unbundling of work. So I'd like to know, given what each of you explained about your topic, what do you think is the best way to respond to this kind of more disaggregated, loose form of work? I'll open up the floor to anyone who'd like to answer first.
Maybe jump in to get things started. So what can we do with gig work, basically, is the question. How do we handle it? So I think one thing that I'm sometimes frustrated by in the space is the assumption that gig work always equals precarious work. I think that definitely exists. I think some forms of gig work, when depended on entirely, can be quite precarious and volatile. I do think, though, there is an opportunity to use them. I spoke a little bit about, the automatization of work and where they can be helpful in career transitions. I think in our work, what we've seen is when you you take the precarious only label off and you start to look at gig work and what it can provide and the optionality it can provide. When workers are going through, big career transitions, they might not have as much work experience in a particular skill set, or they might be going through, a 2-year training program to facilitate that transition. Using gig work, projects, freelance work, those types of smaller units of work can actually give them more exposure to the work environment that they might want to be transitioning into full time. I relied on a couple gig opportunities to transition into product. It gave me a very early view of what working at a tech company would be like when I was fresh out of university, and I really enjoyed it. And because I had a little taste of what it looked like, I was able to transition probably a little bit faster and more seamlessly than I would without those experiences. So that would be my response.
Thank you very much.
I'll jump in here and say I completely agree with what Carolyn's talking about, but it's important to recognize, and it's important to recognize the bifurcation of experiences. And I mean, it isn't necessarily a polarity, but there's a big difference between somebody, delivering Uber Eats and somebody like choosing to be a consultant and taking on more professional kind of gigs that are well paid. So I think the biggest issue for me, and I think it's interesting that it's in almost every political party platform in the Canadian federal election right now, is about how our social safety system is not designed to interface with this new system of work. So it's, obviously we want quality of work, and we're actually launching some new work to look at what does quality work mean and how does a skills agenda fit within that. But also thinking about what are the social dimensions in terms of social policy, the EI system, the pension plan system, all of these things that aren't designed to interface with the way that work is changing.
Let me just respond to the question and the two panelists' responses. So I think institutions and regulations definitely play a very big role. In California, over the last year or so, they have put in place, so the big platforms like Uber, Instagram, and others have put in place this proposition where they have enshrined in the Californian Constitution, where gig workers are actually going to become a third class of workers. And this has been going back and forth in the court system there, and then and because of this win, we're seeing similar maneuvering of platforms in Canada, who is also trying to make sure, we want to make sure workers are actually misclassified for the benefit where the employment relationship will be in such a way where employers will be less responsible for what happens to the workers themselves. And this is directly linked to the type of quality of work that we are going to be seeing. So this is not purely a question of technology. It is also a question of what type of institutions do we want to put in place, like those social safety nets, but also what is recognized as work and who's a worker in this respect.
Thank you. Maybe I can just add to this question a little bit. So both Terrell and Michael, you mentioned kind of unbundling of work, and this makes me think of kind of a transition from people having careers to jobs or short-term tasks, and maybe disaggregation in terms of people are working more remotely. And so perhaps more generally than just gig work, do any of the four of you think there are some specific responses necessary to either manage or capitalize on this unbundling or disaggregation?
So, I mean, I think it's a huge question, right? Some of the, and I think to jump off some of the things that Tricia was saying earlier about the international aspect of the problem, some of the work that I did when I was previously at the Mowat Center focused on, these digital platforms as frequently as they create problems in places like Canada, and we're talking about precarious work here. There's also emerging this problem that is a problem for both people working in developing countries and people working in places like Canada, where you have these digital platforms which are international, and they're essentially leveling down to you can get much cheaper labor in places that don't have worker protections or worker rights on these digital platforms, and especially as we're atomizing things down into micro tasks, where the sort of the skill level required to perform these tasks is becoming more. It's essentially commodifying labor. You have this problem where, because there's no overarching international regulation, there are abuses of workers on these platforms, and also work that previously was being done in more highly regulated environments is being atomized or is being unbundled, and then is being shipped out in what is essentially a regulatory arbitrage play to enable companies to avoid their responsibilities. And so this is all a long-winded way of saying that there's an important international regulatory response that needs to be made here. And then I'll just close in Canada. I mean, I think we really need to think about, these digital platforms, this technological advance, it's really like the promise here is to deliver abundance, right? And we need as a society to decide, well, what is a basic standard of living that we want to offer everybody, regardless of what their job is? And I think that we have been incredibly timid from a political perspective in terms of identifying those things which we think everyone should have. I mean, the fact that we have universal Medicare, but no universal pharmacare, no universal dental care, vision care, all these sorts of things, is a little strange to me. And are we saying that whether you have glasses should depend on whether you have a job? Like, it's kind of baffling. And if we want innovation economy that includes everyone and raises everyone up and uses the potential of everyone, I think we need to think about this as an investment in our workforce. So I'll stop there. I've talked a long time.
Thank you. On mute again. Fascinating discussion, but I have to relinquish my mic monopoly and let the audience ask some questions. So we have one here that says, major companies like Google are saying certification and skill is what matters, not the degree from university. Do you suggest in the future we should focus on the skill and experience university? And maybe I'd add to that, does that sort of focus enhance accessibility or diversity?
Well, I think it's a this is actually an empirical question that we're testing several pilot projects right now. I'm very curious what Tara Lynn probably has thoughts on this too. I mean, this goes to what she's talking about the atomization, or like even learning now is becoming unbundled, right? So there's a lot of talk in education circles about micro credentials. And certainly there's been a lot of activity. You can Google micro credentials, you'll see them. You're absolutely right. The question is around Google. I think the tech companies are kind of leading the way in this. But I think it's still TBD about how employers in general respond to micro credentials. So this is something that we're testing through several innovation project partnerships that we have at the Future Skills Center, which is, if you have somebody go through a micro credential program, which is much shorter in terms of time commitment, in terms of cost, are they coming out with skills that actually translate into better jobs or better livelihood opportunities? Right now, we don't have the evidence to say one way or the other, but it does seem to be a trend, and it's something we're testing.
I can jump in on top of that. I think what we see when we work with employers and some of our partners in terms of the things that they're doing in their hiring practice and how they're thinking about skills and education requirements. I think Michael had actually mentioned this, that a lot of the times employers don't know what skill sets actually sit within the company to begin with. So it's really hard to determine what skills that they actually need or are hiring for. And I mean, there's an ongoing joke in the HR departments that some of the requirements that you see on job postings, those technologies or those skills haven't even been around for the amount of years of experience that they're requesting. So I think there's just, the shelf life of a skill is getting shorter and shorter. It's harder to keep track of. But I think where companies are investing is in the types of technologies that can profile an individual beyond have you been to university or not. Like, they're actually looking at what skills do you have? Can we assess those skills at a very granular level? And that's where technology really has an important part to play, because it can actually represent the individual at those atomic units rather than just a one-page resume, even though there is, valuable information in that as well. So employers that we work with are really keen. They're really keen into making these investments because at the end of the day, they want people with certain skill sets, and they're willing to recognize whatever, information that they can that actually delivers, an education or a credential. Those are all proxies for skills. At the end of the day, they just want to know what skills that you have. So from what we see, they're very open to it. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and Tara Lynn stole a lot of my thunder there. The one thing I would add to that is just that I think we do need to focus on support for employers in this respect, to help them understand what their skills needs are. And I think that what Trisha's point about micro-credentials is really important, because if employers can understand what their skills are, it's at that point that you can start designing micro-credentials which correspond at a sort of much higher level of fidelity to what those identified needs actually are. And I think some of the things that I mentioned in my presentation, sort of agreement or more agreement on typologies and what sort of those atoms of skill or specific tools or techniques is important. And I think that and that assessment is a critical piece of this as well.
Yeah, and I think often when we talk about training and then what type of technology is being brought on board, it would be very critical to make sure, workers often will say, why are we implementing this? Or I'm actually not trusting this new technology to do the work, because often it is not that clean cut, right? Like, when you're actually interfacing with a new technology, there are a lot of resistance, but also there are a lot of errors that actually comes about. So I don't think it's that clean cut. And I think this is where the feedback of workers and also those who have representation in terms of worker unions is very critical in terms of what type of training, because the organization and then the mirroring between the future of work and then the future of education is actually this tandem dance, right? But what we're seeing is actually there's more lower quality work potentially being produced. And in terms of education, where, would that be the same as well? Is the atomization, let's say Duolingo, for language learning, is that really quality education and learning that we want?
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, maybe in a slightly different direction. It's suggestions, or do you have suggestions for managers of teams in a hybrid work environment as we emerge from COVID? And maybe you can give me kind of your technical expertise answer or your personal experience answer. Up to you.
Turn off your Slack notifications while giving presentations.
I think the biggest one is both personal and professional. I'm an anthropologist by training. So I think behind all of this technology is still a deep need to be human and to connect in a very human way with people. So I think technology is the tool that's letting us work remotely or in a hybrid environment, but looking for those opportunities, whether it's, some sort of team social event that's even over technology or turning on your video and saying, how are you? Having a morning coffee session. It's looking for those times to connect as human beings. I think that gives our work meaning and purpose.
I would just build on what Tricia said there and say that one of the things that I have noticed in research is that the amount of time and the amount of effort and resources required to do these sorts of things right, both in the context of remote work, but also in collaborative work prior to COVID, is almost always underestimated and underinvested in. And so I think as a manager, especially as a senior manager, so that you need to carve out time both for yourself, but also for the people working under you, so that they have the time to put in the effort and the resources needed to enable those connections, to build those connections. Because I think almost everyone's default assumption is the amount of time this is going to take, or the upkeep that these relationships are going to keep, is a significant underestimation of what's required.
I hate to sprint past all of these interesting topics, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question before we close. From the audience, Amy asks, how do employers begin to recognize beyond the resume?
I don't know if it's a well-formed thought at this point, but I'll jump in because no one else is jumping in. But I think a resume can just be viewed as one signal, and there are a variety of other signals. And I guess for employers actually to be clear on what they're exactly looking for in a role, I think they obviously have a pretty good idea, and just treating, a resume as one signal. But I think what we see now in workers and how they are going about certain networking strategies, or how they're being trained to increasingly connect more and more online, there's lots of digital representations of their skill set and talent, right? Whether that's blogging or, LinkedIn, there are different ways to represent yourself online that can be used as different signals, but also just taking maybe the pieces that are represented in a resume, and then actually, things like skills, things like certifications, and not viewing, there's a very standard approach sometimes to just viewing a resume and saying, okay, do you have X number of years of work experience, and do you have a degree? Obviously, there's other things within a resume you can look at for stronger signals that you might be looking for anyway. So I would say maybe those are some strategies to go beyond a resume.
Thank you. Well, with that, I think we have to wrap up. So first of all, thanks to the ICTC crew behind the scenes doing the hosting magic. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us today. Hopefully you've enjoyed hearing from our panelists half as much as I did. And thank you once again to Michael, Tricia, Teralyn, and Kai. Bye for now.